The first cut, how a gravel rut and a smile started a war. I still remember the first time I saw her come through my gate with that same self-satisfied little smile, like she was dropping by to borrow a cup of sugar from the devil himself. It was a crisp late summer morning, and the corn stood hip high, the farm smelled sweet and stubborn, and the old gravel lane that led from the county road to my barn wore the kind of ruts that only a decade of tractors and storms and my own two hands could forgive uneven, honest, and private. She rolled down the window without asking, leaned into the humid air as if she owned the smell of wet earth, and called, "You're blocking the public path," like she was checking a moral box on her way to brunch. I'd seen HOA types before, clipped and bracing, convinced a deed-covered checkbox could reroute a lifetime of common sense. I was ready for a polite explanation about property lines or a civil dispute over access. I wasn't ready for her to laugh when I told her it was my land, to get out of her Ford like it was a throne, and stride like she'd never soil her shoes by touching soil that didn't have an HOA plaque in front of it. That laugh, brittle as a crack in a patio tile, was the beginning, the tiny sound that turned into a roar. After that summer, she started coming through more, always without permission, always in that same blue car, always with that same expression that said, to her, my fence and my gate and my no trespassing signs were merely ornaments for her moral calendar. She'd swerve through the gap I'd left for my own pickups, dispatching the headlights like a monarch assessing peasants. She'd drive past the pasture where my horses grazed and honked like a drill instructor, as if my land and its animals existed to provide her a sound stage for indignation. At first I tried to reason with her, polite notes affixed to her windshield, recorded phone calls where I asked her to stop, even a certified letter that outlined my land deed and the county maps showing the lane entirely on my property. Those were shrugged off like cobwebs. The HOA sent her a memo telling her to keep her distance, and that memo was burned in the tiny furnace of her contempt. She showed me the reply with glee. "You own a farm, so what?" The HOA, it turns out, was a clubhouse with teeth, but no backbone, a small pond of people who liked rules until the rules demanded inconvenience. I started to journal every incident, not out of some lawyer's swing, but because I couldn't let the small humiliations blur into a fog. The tires on my grass from last fall's harvest left where her SUV had been, the stray cigarette, but in my flower bed, the time she drove so close to the barn that my old hound bolted and skinned his paw. Each moment stacked like boards in a lean-to, each one was a small, undeniable trespass. My neighbors, at first amused by the theater, "That Karen," they'd say, hands on hips, half jest and half warning, were soon listening with new attention when I told the truth about her trespasses and what they implied. That someone believed a line on a spreadsheet carried the moral force of an immovable law. Late into a November that had no intention of staying warm, I stood at the gate with a thermos, watching fog crawl off my fields and thinking about escalation the way a farmer thinks about frost, not as something to revel in, but as an inevitability to be prepared for. I didn't want war. I wanted the right to walk my land without being interrupted by entitlement. But she treated my refusal to let her behave like she was the sheriff as an invitation to prove me wrong. So I started to prepare, not in the way of an arsonist or thief, but the way of someone who knows paperwork, county officers, and the bureaucracy that binds civilized life. I dug up old plats at the recorder's office, found survey markers, took photographs of where the lane truly lay, recorded the time and date of every unauthorized entrance, and filed them away in a crisp, increasingly righteous file. I sent the county a polite complaint. I wrote to the local wildlife conservation office about erosion caused when that car stitched its way across a seasonal creek bank. Each small administrative act felt like stitching a wound closed with clean thread. There was electricity in putting my life on paper, in refusing the emotional blackmail of being told I had to tolerate it because she felt entitled. Still, every box checked and every letter sent only served to amplify the danger of the thing I was facing. She didn't respect boundaries. She respected power. And power, when unchecked, gets bolder. The first time I saw her drive through after I had taped a private property, no motor vehicle sign across the gate, she did it with a look of challenge, as if to say she could make a new rule with the petrol in her tank. That's when I knew that this would no longer be about letters and signs. It would be about stakes, my property, my peace, and whatever remained of my patience. The long game, documents, witnesses, and a plan that was all law and leverage. I decided once and for all that I would fight her in the one arena she claimed to thrive in: appearances, consequences, and the leverage of public record. But I refused to stoop to theatrics that would make me worse than her. I would let legality and quiet cunning do the work for me. The first step was simple and boring and therefore perfect. I had the parcel surveyed again, a meticulous job that required a polite donation of time and coffee to the county surveyor, who loved maps the way some men loved football. He came out with his instruments and his patience and confirmed what the old stones and the deed always had. The lane, she insisted, was a public way, had no claim on county rolls. He signed his report with a precise, bureaucratic flourish and handed me a copy that felt heavier than the 200-pound gate I'd welded together years ago. Next, I started to gather witnesses, not the flashy kind who'd stage an intervention and then disappear, but the elderly farmer down the road who'd lived near this county line since Eisenhower, the mail carrier who delivered packages on a route that knew every pothole, and the teenage girl who'd worked for me last summer and could testify to the times Karen drove through when I wasn't home. Their testimonies were straightforward, honest, and boring in a way that made them utterly poisonous in court. A line of small facts, each one a pebble that, when piled, made an unassailable rock. I filed a formal trespass complaint and attached my survey, the witness statements, and a packet of photos that documented tire tracks, the times of day she drove through, and the notes I'd left on her windshield. I did not threaten. I did not shout. I wrote like a man who had already won, because he knew the law favored those who could show a clean paper trail and a clean conscience. At the same time, I made quieter, practical moves. I repaired the drainage along the lane, not to create a trap but to prevent erosion, and documented those repairs with invoices and receipts. I set up a weatherproof camera on a discreet post, not to gloat, but to collect proof. The few seconds of her face as she slid through the gate after dark, the angle of her vehicle's headlights when she made a point of blaring them, the smoke of a cigarette tossed aside. I checked legal statutes about installing barriers and found, to my relief, that a properly marked gate and a permitted sign were legitimate. So I added both: the permit application, the installed gate, the municipal stamp on the plan, each an incantation that transformed an emotional fight into a civic process. Karen, by then, had realized she was losing the public narrative. The HOA's newsletters had begun to carefully avoid her name. Neighbors who once whispered Karen with a giggle now gave her a cooler silence. That is the thing about social capital. It looks nothing like the flashy kind. It is accrued subtly, frame by patient frame. I arranged a small community meeting at the Grange, invited the county zoning officer, and let the questions be asked openly: what constitutes a public way, who has authority over access, and what are the liabilities when someone drives across private property? The county man, with his tie a bit too bright and his lunchbox of ordinances, answered patiently and, to Karen's fury, confirmed the process we had ticked off. She showed up to that meeting to make theatrical demands, to assert in a voice meant for the courthouse of public opinion that people have a right to use that lane. But the room had my surveys, the legal stamps, and 100 tiny facts and binders. Her spectacle fell apart into the small, normal sounds of people flipping pages. I pressed no button that night, made no speech that painted her as a villain in colorful strokes. Instead, I arranged fact upon fact and let the weight do what melodrama could not. Meanwhile, I took care of my farm. I harvested, fixed fences, fed the hounds, made sure the horses had water. This was important. The most persuasive person I could be was a steady one, someone whose life had meaning beyond a feud. The county sent a notice: cease and desist from unauthorized vehicular use, effective immediately. The notice didn't feel like victory because it was a document, but it was a thing that came with force if ignored. It was also an invitation to choose, to comply and step back, or to show the world that you would break the law to prove a petty point. Karen refused in the way of people who feel entitled to a fight because it affirms some interior script. She posted on the neighborhood forum about public access, made inflammatory comments, and then when words failed, came through at twilight, like an actor returning to a role. I didn't expect fireworks. I expected, instead, the inevitable that the law I'd assembled would either work or would be the thing that made her slip. I had no taste for illegality, no desire to hide behind a ploy. My plan was to let bureaucracy, documentation, and community pressure rearrange the elements. The long game, I had learned, is a patient one, played with ink and witnesses and the slow, unromantic grind of the recorder's office, but it has a terrible power. It turns entitlement into paperwork. And paperwork has teeth when it is wielded correctly. The moment, mud, mirrors, and the way the world notices when rules are ignored. It happened on a gray Tuesday when the sky looked like a metal roof, and the kind of rain that doesn't announce itself but simply arrives to make life inconvenient came and soaked everything. I was in the barn mending a harness when I heard the distant sound of tires on gravel that wasn't mine, reliable, outraged staccato that belonged to one driver alone. I didn't rush. I never rush when I want to watch someone fall into consequence. Panicked moves only make for messy stories, but I went to the side window to watch. She came through exactly the way she always had. Lights on, chin up, playing a version of herself that wanted witnesses. The rain had turned the lanes smoother and duller, and perhaps because her mood made her reckless, Karen sped a little. I watched as the car nosed into the field just beyond the gate where the soil held the memory of summer storms. Something then that I cannot claim as planning and would never advise as a tactic occurred. The rain had softened the earth, and the car, heavy and obstinate, began to resist. I will not describe the minute engineering of tires and mud. I will not tell you how to get a car stuck. That would be a menu for troublemakers. What I will say is this. She found herself in the kind of predicament that only comes when pride meets environment. The wheels spun, the front sank, and for the first time the smugness on her face flinched. She tried to open the door, and her boot slipped, the hem of her designer jacket dampening at the cuff. I did not cheer. I never have the appetite for humiliation as pure sport, but there was a terrible, giddy satisfaction in seeing someone who had made a habit of trampling boundaries face a moment where those boundaries pushed back. The scene that followed was theatrical, and naturally it was quickly captured by more neutral forces than my binoculars. A passing courier stopped to make a phone call. A neighbor rolled up, slowed by habit at the edge of my property. Someone else filmed it on their phone, because modern empathy is a feed of small recordings. Karen stood by her open car door in the rain, trying to gather composure, to appear as if the situation was an inconvenience rather than a consequence. She shouted something to me across the sodden field about entitlement, and this being a public way. I called back, not loudly, but in a voice steady enough to be heard, that she was trespassing and that the county had issued an order. I offered, with as much civility as I could, to call a tow. She refused. Pride has many forms, and one of them is the refusal to accept help when it undermines a story you tell yourself about being right. The tow came anyway, paid for by the HOA as a way to close a breach, and the driver, a taciturn man who knew his trade, hooked the car and pulled. There was no dramatic ripping of metal or malicious act on my part, just the slow, correct movement of consequence meeting entitlement. The internet did its work. Her car, the soggy field, the remnants of cigarette filters in my flower bed, small damning details, looped on a dozen feeds. The local paper, always hungry for the spectacle of small-town drama, ran a piece that quoted the county's survey and the cease and desist order, and included a picture of Karen trying to coax a smile, as if the camera had not been watching her lose a little of what made her dangerous, the casual certainty that rules were for other people. The car, in the days after, became a visible sign of a reputation tarnished. Neighbors who had been amused turned guarded, and the HOA started issuing statements that were careful and legalistic, a style of speech that seeks to avoid scandal by acknowledging policy. I received messages from people I'd never met, some offering support, others offering small kindnesses, a bag of feed, a hand with a broken fence post. Karen lost more than a car that day. She lost the community's indulgence. People began to talk about respect in a different tone. My lawyers, I had consulted one out of caution, Never imagining an escalation of this level, advised restraint. We did not pursue criminal charges. We did pursue a civil remedy for repeated trespass, and the county, which might have been indifferent had the problem been a single incident, took a sterner tone when a pattern appeared. The thing that surprised me was that I did not feel vindictive pleasure so much as quiet relief. I had wanted peace more than I had wanted to see her humbled. When the tow truck left with her car, the field looked like a place that had been disturbed and then closed, a clean wound. She wrote a public apology eventually, the sort that reads like an exercise in damage control. Moments of poor judgment, she called it, and promised to follow the law. I did not publish the photos I had taken at dawn that winter when she had driven through during deer season and nearly frightened fawns. I did not gloat about small things, but the message had been sent. My property was not a theater for her displays. The world notices things like repeated trespass when they accumulate into a pattern, and patterns endanger reputations. That day, her reputation became a small casualty of a larger, slower justice. Aftermath: what justice looked like when it was slow, lawful, and surprisingly humane in the weeks and months after mud, there was an odd settling like a storm cloud that breaks and leaves the air clearer. Karen's apology, posted on the HOA board and repeated in a shorter version to anyone who'd ask at the grocery store, read as carefully as someone practicing confession. She volunteered in the community garden for a season, her hands in soil that had previously been beneath her car tires. A detail that annoyed the part of me that liked theatrical justice and comforted the practical part that preferred healing. The county's civil injunction required that she cease vehicular use of my lane and that she pay for any damage verified by my receipts. It was small money in the context of what pride costs, but it was the proper legal outcome. More importantly, the injunction put a line in the ledger where the ledger needed a line. My life returned to its rhythms: the horses, the harvest, the slow pleasures of autumn wine and winter preserves. People who had watched the feud from porches began to stop by more often with pies and offers to help with the fence, the kind of neighborliness that grows back when a threat to common sense is finally handled. I found myself reflecting on what made her car pay the price meant. It had not been an act of sabotage staged in the dead of night. It had been a convergence of things: patience, paperwork, community, and an environment that doesn't care who you are when you ignore it. She had, in her own way, been taught that there are consequences beyond mockery. There's record, there's law, there is the slow evaporation of social license. In time, I repaired the patches of grass where tires had gouged. I reseeded and tended and watched green return. Karen, for her part, began to speak differently at HOA meetings. The edge in her voice, the assumption of dominance, had been softened by the reality that other people had rights too, and that those rights could be defended without cruelty. She and I never became friends. Resentment leaves a furrow that doesn't always heal into companionship, but we reached an uneasy civility born of mutual recognition that the county lines are not mere suggestions. My story, once it drifted into the wider world, became a cautionary tale for others who liked the sensation of power without the discipline of consequence. Don't treat someone's land like a runway for entitlement. I kept the old camera, the binders, the surveys. They were not trophies, but insurance, a reminder that vigilance and measured action are sometimes the difference between being victimized and being respected. Most of all, I learned that justice, when sober and patient, looks less like spectacle and more like restoration. The car, which had been precious to her because it was a symbol, a polished shell for a certain image, was repaired, sold, and eventually traded for something more economical. She told a neighbor she'd learned humility. Whether she truly had or merely learned to dress humility for public viewing mattered less than the community's renewed calm. I stayed out of the spotlight that followed. I mended fences and fed the dogs and kept the gate locked for reasons that were practical rather than vengeful. And on clear mornings when fog curled off the fields and the gravel lane caught the sun in a way that made the world look almost new, I would walk it and say a small, private thanks to the dull, enduring power of doing things right, documenting, asking for help, calling witnesses, and letting the machinery of rules and common decency move at its patient pace. In the end, I never wanted to teach anyone a lesson by breaking laws or creating hazards. I only wanted to teach that property, boundaries, and respect are not optional. The car had paid in reputation and in the slow mathematics of right and wrong. The farm, meanwhile, kept growing corn and feeding people and making, in its quiet, a kind of justice that is not loud but lasts.